Welcome, everyone. I am Daniela Bleichmer. I am the director of the USC Levan Institute for the Humanities, and I am delighted you have joined us for today's event that is part of the series on writing, organized by Emily Anderson and David Ulen. We're going to ask everyone to please mute themselves for the first part of the program when David and Emily will engage our speakers in conversation. And afterwards, we will open it up for discussion and questions with everyone. And at that point, if you can please use the raise hand under reactions, that will help Emily and David make sure that everybody who wants to come in is visible to them. Today's event is being recorded and will be available on our website, as are all the other events that are part of this series. So if you want to catch up on past events, they are available on our series, as will be our next event, which will be in April, and which Emily and David will tell you a little bit more about. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm not sure if I'm passing this on to Emily or David, but Emily, take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much, Daniela, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. I'm going to do the pre-intro and then turn it over to David, but just want to reiterate our thanks to Daniela and the Levan for supporting this. It was a new series that we began in the fall, if you haven't tuned in before, but we've been trying to put together these events so they kind of build upon each other in a way. And this would be our fifth one. So we've come to what we're calling like writing across media. And when David and I and Daniela also were talking about this, we were thinking of like, how can we continue to grow our conversations and our thoughts about what the writing process entails, especially if we expand that sense of writing beyond a kind of sense of just either like longhand working with pen on paper or, you know, typing words into a computer, or what in our last event, I think Percival Everett referred to as the machine. But, you know, we all work in such a range of genres and venues now, and such a range of disciplines, that we thought broadening this sense of writing to encompass other media, other forms, other practices would be really fruitful for all of us. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish today. And our format will be similar to the format of past sessions. So again, if you're new, we are going to, David will be introducing briefly our individual speakers, and we're going to go down our list, letting everyone kind of just speak extemporaneously, conversationally, for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll turn it over. We'll open up the whole panel for general conversation and questions from the rest of you. And then finally, I will just say we have confirmed our final event in this series, as Daniela mentioned, which will be held on Wednesday, April 14th. The time is going to be slightly different. It's going to be from 9 in the morning till 10:30 Pacific Standard Time. And we are culminating our event with our series with an event we're calling Writers in Conversation. And it's going to feature a dialogue between our own Maggie Nelson and the British journalist and novelist Hari Kunzru. And they are going to just talk, like, hopefully the conversation will encompass all the themes we've been working toward this year. So what it means to write across forms, what it means to write in a variety of different disciplines for a variety of different audiences, challenges, opportunities, and particularly kind of thoughts on the role and the responsibility of the writer, both within academia and within the kind of public sphere, public square, as Amber calls it. So with that being said, that's on the website too. I will turn it over to David for the individual introductions.
Great, thanks, Emily. As Emily said, this is the fifth in our year-long series of 6. And we've been sort of covering a lot of different territory. We're really excited about all of the panels that we've done. Really excited about this panel, and definitely excited about the discussion between Maggie and Hari. That will be a little early, 9 a.m. West Coast time, but I think there's nothing better than having breakfast with a couple of writers talking about, about craft and style and all sorts of things. So we will call that a breakfast gathering. We're having a lunch gathering now. I'm really delighted to have this panel. I'm going to introduce everyone briefly. As Emily said, we're going to have, ask all the panelists to kind of present for, I think, for about 10 minutes and talk a bit about what their process, their projects, how they are writing across boundaries. I'll let them all kind of talk a little bit more about themselves than have me present the introductions, because those things always feel like they're just, we want to get right to the conversation. And then after everyone presents, we'll, Emily and I'll come back in and we'll sort of facilitate the conversation between the panelists and all of you. I also just want to say before we start, I want to thank all of today's panelists for participating. I want to thank Daniela and the Levan for giving us this platform to kind of pursue this series and the kind of space to pursue it creatively and intuitively. I'm really grateful for that. And I also just want to say, because I don't know that I've said it publicly, I just want to thank Emily for being an amazing collaborator. It's been a blast putting this together. So,
you do.
so without further ado, I'm just going to introduce very quickly with their, their designations from the website, the 4 panelists for today. And then we've got kind of, and then I'll kind of tell you how it's going to go. So basically our 4 panelists are Robert Hernandez, who's a professor, of professional practice at USC Annenberg, M.G. Lord, associate professor of the practice of English, USC Dornsife, Nushin Rostami, an adjunct assistant professor at USC School of Cinematic Arts, and Donna Spruitt-Metz, who's the research professor of psychology at USC Dornsife Center for Economic and Social Research. We kind of put it all in the sorting hat, and Nushin has agreed to start us off, and then MG will follow, and then Donna, and then we will close out the kind of individual presentations with Robert. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the trip. Nushin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me in this panel. I'm excited to hear everyone else and just be part of the conversation. I did prepare a presentation, and I was wondering if I could share my screen. Is that possible? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that's fine. We're set up for anyone who wants to share a screen of the panels. We're set up for that.
Perfect. Okay, so before I share it, this is going to be images and some conversation around my work. I'm actually not a writer, I'm an artist, but writing comes to my practice in all sorts of forms, and it's either produced through the work or it's something that comes beforehand. So I thought to sort of talk about the existence of language within my practice, and then kind of introduce the work through that. So I'm an artist, designer, educator. I actually teach media arts, fundamentals to graphic design at USC. I've been a teacher for about 9 years now. And I moved from Tehran, Iran to get my master's degree in New York City. I'm based in New York. But I mean, I'm not a writer, but I'm a storyteller and I'm an abstract thinker. I think I'm gonna present this as a full slide so that you actually see it. I'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of my work is actually through very abstract language. I use abstract form like triangles, circles, and different shapes, but then it's a lot of story building through that abstraction. I flow in between mediums in my work, from drawing to sculpture to performance to installation, and not necessarily in that order. Sometimes a sculpture turns into a drawing, and the drawing turns into a performance, and the performance turns into installation. It really is a very, very fluid process. I don't necessarily contain myself within one form or one medium. And all of this is for the purpose of pointing to ways of seeing and connecting outside of textual or verbal language, which I feel like it's kind of interesting, being amongst all writers to talk about like forms that are sort of bring text into conversation, but it actually exists outside of text and verbal language. So I thought to sort of talk about different things like sculptures and performance and show you some work of like what it means, all of these storytellings within sculptures. This is a recent piece that I did in 2020 actually, which is called Zaman. And it's a sculptural piece that sort of draws light. My practice specifically over the past 3 years has been with the language of light, and I'm actually putting together a vocabulary of sort of like light activations and how every single sort of aesthetic of these light activation brings about a different sort of landscape within the mind. So this piece is sort of drawing different landscapes of light. As you see, the sculpture might not necessarily tell what is happening, but I wanted you to see it in daylight and then what happens at night, like basically when all the light turns off and there's only one spotlight that is on to the sculpture. There are these discs that sort of rotate. So the sculptural aspects are rotating disc under a spotlight. And as every single plane, which is a circle that goes under the light, the drawing that happens of the light on the wall sort of shifts and change. And there's this ever-changing landscape of light happening in front of you, all reflections of physical objects onto the space. And there's no sort of technology, digital technology really embedded into the work itself. There are videos available of all these things, but I know my time is very limited, so I'm gonna just go through these work. And this is like one of the landscapes created through the drawing of light, which is like in my studio, I call it the galaxy because there's this green light that sort of fills up the room. And then I have this horizon of water that the combination creates in sort of extraterrestrial scenery that is an invitation to look afar and think as if you're looking into the universe while you're standing in a physical room and only looking at reflections of physical objects. So from that, I want to go to this idea of narrative building. A lot of my work has this aspect of starting from a place and then throughout a performance or through an action, the sculpture is activated in the space. And through that activation, we arrive to an installation, which is sort of the end result of the performance. And that is the story from the beginning. My stories are usually coming from an extremely personal space. I've been in exile for 11 years, meaning I haven't been able to go back to my country. And this shift of immigration from Iran to the US felt like a flip of a coin, that a lot of like my perception of identity, self, and like culture, or a lot of things changed. And my work became this platform for me to rediscover things or discover things. So I did a series of work, performance-based work specifically, but again, there's elements of drawing and elements of sculpture in there, which is called Geometry of Exile. And this is the narrative of the piece, which is very abstract and very minimal. It's like, if you have a line and this line is sort of made out of these triangles. So if you see closely, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 triangles that are put together that create this line. If you fragment this line into triangles, like you start opening it up and take it out of that border line, then can you bring it back to a line again? This is like, again, abstract thinking. It's a line fragmented into triangles. Can these fragmentation come back to a line? But the deeper poetics of the piece was that if you sort of fragment a border into a landscape, and triangle is that form that sort of goes from like water to mountains to houses to tents to all these like different notions of landscape that, again, on an abstract level, it gives it gives an open space to the audience to think of like, what landscape do you want to see? But if you sort of break the border into a landscape, can you bring that back into a border? And the piece had like sort of a puzzle that I stand on top of it, or later on I want the audience to stand on top of it, and I give them the problem to solve, that you have a line and you're going to move yourself with these triangles from point A to point B. Can you bring the sculpture back to a line when you get to the point B? So the audience goes into the room and they're sort of struggling with the pieces. The pieces are not supposed to overlap on top of each other. You don't take phone, you're there yourself alone in the room with like these pieces of triangles in the room, and you're solving something. And sometimes for you to move forward, you have to move backward. And as you flip these triangles, because on one side it's reflective and one side black, the space changes and the room is constantly shifting with these fluid forms of light in the room. And the problem essentially is unsolvable. And you go in the room and you get to that point and you move.
No, I'm fine.
A prompt.
This is awesome. I've never heard it by yet.
Was there a question? Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. The piece actually was opened up to a bigger group of people, because immigration is something that like it involves more people. It's like group of people moving. So I made this really big sculptures, and this is with in collaboration with another artist, Jimenez Sarno. So the sculpture in the middle is her work, and mine was like sort of a horizon line. And then 11 participant, sort of voluntary participant from audience joined the performance and moved themselves from one point of the gallery to another one. And in the end, the triangles lean against the wall, and there's this horizon line of like mirror-like sculptures that are sort of reflecting light in the room. And it's the border is now fragmented into a landscape. So that's sort of the element of narrative: point A, point B, point C, like border, movement, landscape. Like it's sort of like it boils down to those very, very abstract elements, but then within the room with the body and with the sculpture, it's sort of activated, and it creates multiplicity of stories. So it's no longer about my private story, although it emerges from that point, but because of its abstract notion, it allows the room for the audience to think about their own story. And I had multiple times of people coming to me and telling how like they like telling their own life story to me, and how the sculpture sort of activated that in them. And I really liked the abstract language in there, because I felt like that quality was what gave them the space to think about their own story, see their own reflection in the piece, as opposed to really knowing what it is that I think. And this narrative almost always is sort of activated through performance. This is where I finally felt the stability in life, that I'm going to fall through life, because for the immigration process was extremely cumbersome. And there were all these like moments in life that I felt like, oh my God, am I going to fall through? Is this it? Or am I stable? Am I holding myself? And I feel like that goes through a lot. This notion of stability and instability goes through a lot of things in life for a lot of people. It's sort of a psychological state, and it doesn't necessarily only comes from like a story of immigration. For me, that was a departure point, but it could be anything else in life. So I built this sculpture that goes between stability and this fluctuating form that can fall through. There are these metal structures that are all folded at a unique angle, and the wooden platforms that when you place them on top of one another, if the angle is right, it can hold my weight. But if the angle is not right, the sculpture becomes wobbly and I can fall through. And the performance is sort of building this platform that is going to hold my body. And as I build it, there is this reflective surface that is as if you're creating an image of yourself, and you're finally allowing to see your own self in it. The whole sculpture is sitting on top of iron sand, and the metals are attached to a magnet. As I am going through this struggle of like figuring out the stability and instability, the sand underneath is activated and it's drawing my performance. And so you can see this is sort of the process of the activation as I get to a point that the full sculpture is built. And then this is the final, like I have this sort of micro macro view of it. This is the final installation sort of responds to the space of the gallery, the light of the gallery, and then you can get really close to the sculpture. And once you see it, it again places you in a landscape. The tallness of these metal structures and the sand underneath it, for me, was such a landscape of Tehran where I grew up. And it's like as if you're in between these tall buildings, but the buildings with no faces. So you get close to the piece, it has a story. You are afar from it, it gives you another sort of story. And this is from above that you can see the drawing of the performance and how it sort of translates into, you know, an activation of like, it translates into a drawing basically in the end. And that was the installation that was in the gallery for about a month. And this is a drawing that I did years before the performance happened. And later on, I find these relationships between the work that I was like, oh my God, this is as if this is this piece and this is this piece. And it's sort of things connecting. And that's why I say it's very fluid in the way that I move from drawing to sculpture to performance and like all these other forms. There is an allegorical approach into my practice. And this one is a piece called Corner of My Room and the Alleyway to the Prison's Garden that spoke to my relationship to my parents while I was going through this process of exile, that I felt like I had very limited time to see them. When we saw each other, it felt like we're all in this small room and we have to catch up for all the not catching up, or they're gonna be in this landscape that is just, I have no access to them. So Corner of My Room is sort of speaks to this closeness that is exaggerated into this form that is just not natural, and you really wanna see them, but I'm like, I just cannot connect what's happening. And the Alleyway to the Prison's Garden is actually the name of the street where my father grew up. And it's this place that it's non-existing. I interviewed both my parents when I saw them. My father passed away, but this is the last interview that I did with my father. And based on the interviews that I had, I created a space dedicated to them. So Corner of My Room is based on my interview with my mother, and the Alleyway to the Prison's Garden, which is this piece, is based on my interview with my dad. And it's sort of like taking elements of landscape that they talk about in their own way of like seeing light and our relationship and things like that, and translating it into these, again, abstract forms into a room. And then when the audience walks in for the Alleyway to the Prison's Garden, it's like a playground of light. They walk in and they work with the structures and move around the sculptures, and they start like building their own narrative and their story and their way of thinking about what it is that they have been placed inside. And then the story of my parents were printed in a catalog that is given to them, so they know what are these elements that they're looking at. And I always think of like this allegorical approach as a way of like stories that exists on different planes and different levels of the work itself. And as you sort of get through like discovering more into the piece and playing more in the piece and paying more attention to it, you get to understand the stories and you put together the narrative yourself. This is the last one. I'm gonna go through it quick. As sometimes language is produced through the performance of object and bodies. Like I'm not putting, it's not something that prompts the piece. And actually when the piece is done, throughout the process, I realize, oh, there are all these language coming out of it. And this is a very new piece and you're going to be the first audience of it. It's called Time. I'm exploring the notion of time, and this is time carved on a piece of soap. And then this soap is the soap that I use on a daily basis and sort of observe how time sort of like dissolves within time. And then see the gradual changes of the soap as it goes through the process of life and time itself. And this is like one cycle of it full, from the point that is edgy and like it has all these corners, and as it gets used and it breaks. And I realized that there are all these verbs that comes to me, and I just wrote some of it, like carve, dissolve time, wash, slip, slide, disappear, hold, fade, sculpt, clear, use, break, last, wait, fly. And it felt like the soap and the time together we're just prompting all these like ways of thinking and writing, and that I'm writing a piece about it, just being prompted by the soap as the object, as this performative object that we all use on a daily basis, and we a lot of times take it for granted, but I felt like it's such an element of time. It tells us so much about the stories of what happened throughout that month that I used this soap. And I felt like it's a more truthful measurement of time than the way that we measure time itself. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
All right, our next presenter is MG Lord. You're muted. MG. There you go.
Hi, everyone. That is a daunting act to follow, especially since my own career has pretty much been a degraded romp through American popular culture, you know, for many decades. March 9th, that would be yesterday, is a meaningless day probably to most Americans, but unfortunately not to me. It is the anniversary of the Barbie doll's release date in 1959. And having, where do I even have these things around here? I just want to prove that they exist. My first major nonfiction book was the actual business story, cultural study of this artifact. So before March 9th, my normally, I don't know, tragically barren email box and relentlessly quiet telephone that never rings. These things are suddenly active because people want me to weigh in on, you know, this notorious product knocked off from a German porn doll by a woman who was thrown out of her own company for lying to the SEC and then went on to make a second fortune designing, I kid you not, mastectomy prostheses, or as she said to me in 1993 over lunch at the Hillcrest Country Club, honey, all my life I've gone from breast to breast. Now, the extreme implausibility of this story is probably why I'm so attached to writing nonfiction, because fiction, naturalistic fiction, is often edited for plausibility. And that story would not pass a round of editing for plausibility. The books I've written, and I guess the things that I have done in my life, I realize, and I am keeping an eye on the time, I realize during COVID, I decided I have not been able to work with a great deal of focus, but I thought maybe, you know, in preparation for my death, whenever it will come, I should clean my storage unit. So I'm less of an irritant to, you know, people related to me who might have to deal with all this. And this threw me back into childhood. And I realize again that the books that I've written have been very much about childhood obsessions, that doll. And I guess my second major book, I had to become a science writer to do it. It was a cultural history of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and a look back at my difficult rocket engineer father. I notice everybody has their static photos up now. So I imagine they're all getting, you know, another cup of coffee or a sandwich. And that's really all right too, because that's kind of how my father treated me as a child. You know, I would want I would want his attention and he would disappear for the cup of, and that's why all those many years later after his death, when I was a very small child, my mother died. I was an only child. My father was much older. I had to take care of my mother. My father disappeared. He was not abducted by aliens, you know, although he was obsessed with space. He disappeared into the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And after Forever Barbie was a bestseller, you know, publishers were interested in what I wanted to write about, and they kept coming up with these notions about gender and culture that didn't engage me. And I realized what I wanted to know was where that damn man went when I needed him. So I spent about 8 years at JPL, and I think I produced a document that isn't just about what ends with the landing of the Opportunity rover in 2004. But I think it's a document about a culture in transition. I got there at a very interesting time in the late 90s when the men who had worked on the missions in the 1960s were beginning to retire. And they were all mechanical engineers, hardware engineers. And suddenly there was this incursion of young women who were software engineers, often women of color. And they were working at the same level as these problematic older male engineers. And I got to watch, a big cultural shift, or what struck me as a really interesting cultural shift. After the stunning visual presentation, I began as a political cartoonist. I thought, well, maybe I'll show you some of my earlier work. And then it occurred to me, well, it's unless the audience is really old, it's going to be like a Jeopardy quiz on, when I started as Newsday's political cartoonist when I left Yale and graduated from, so it would have been, the middle 80s. Well, I don't know. I think we still have a couple of minutes. Why don't I just take you down this little share screen dance of what I was obsessed with 30 years ago. And I am trying to start drawing again. I fled the newspaper when I fled for reasons I'll bring up before my 10 minutes are over. But in the meantime, is it okay if I share screen? I think this will work. I mean, when I do this in a class, I always deputize a whole bunch of co-hosts, and they're all, I haven't done it lately, but the first time I tried those breakout rooms, I lost 6 people, and this was extremely awkward. But now I always have a co-host to retrieve them from, wherever they disappeared to. Let's give this let's see if we can. Yeah, here we go. Let me try this. I'll cue this. I'll spend the rest of my whatever fiddling with this thing and unsuccessfully trying to screen share. Here we go. All right, let's do this. We don't need to share sound. There's no sound. All right, now I'll just, I hope this is large enough. Let's do play. There we go. Yeah, postcards from a time before Photoshop, and I promise this won't take very long. Words to pictures and back. It's just, I think I started right around the inauguration of Reagan. And at the time, it seemed so sinister and malignant, but given what's happened since, it's not sinister, it's almost innocent. And I did love caricatures, and I do love that Nancy Reagan, even now. This makes me hanker to get back to those, makes me hanker to get back to drawing. That was again, wordless images are useful. No one besides scholars of the 1979 and 1980 may remember that in protest, that Carter made a decision that the US Olympic team would not participate in the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, because the Russians the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. This caused him to be pilloried, and it, along with his, what was perceived as his mishandling of the hostages held in Iran after the Iranian Revolution, contributed to his not being reelected. This one I still love. It holds up. Proposed redesign of Supreme Court robes. I mean, nothing has changed, really. Except, well, nothing has changed. Another one where nothing has changed. I'm concerned about the convicts and degenerates who have been dumped on our shores. You can't just give asylum to boatloads of criminals and expect it won't have a negative impact on the country. Well, there's the Mayflower. And I, at least on one side of the family, I bear the curse of being a daughter of the American Revolution. So I think I'm well within, you know, I am certainly able to libel these malignant people and what they started. This one too, I think you could run today. It wouldn't necessarily be the National Security Council, but the idea of please wipe feet before entering, and it's the Constitution as a welcome mat. I mean, these images endure, and that was 1987, and it's still so true. Oh, and this gets back to my childhood. Mary Grace Lord here, that was little me, but this was also a policy decision in the 1980s, and little me, revisited as an adult, says if student loans must be cut by $3 billion to control the federal deficit, how can the president give away $4.6 billion in tuition tax credits? And the teacher, no defining religious paraphernalia, says, let me tell you about the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. Now we're going to get personal. This is me. In my childhood, I don't know if you can see this. If you've got your display on the right-hand side, you probably can't see this. I'm not the pretty little blonde girl at her birthday party. I'm the weirdo out of focus to the side with the tiny notebook. Again, these were all discoveries from going through the childhood photographs. And that's, you know, habitually, I thought I was you know, I have always been hunched in the corner with a tiny notebook, making notes and drawing. And again, the whole obsession with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that led me to be able to understand enough orbital mechanics to explain to the general reader how you actually get a planet from here to Mars, or because the people on the Mars mission that I eventually, you know, the central cast of characters in that book were working on the ill-fated Galileo mission to Jupiter, which was a very complicated trajectory for a variety of reasons that you probably don't want me to discuss. But anyway, as a child, I also found this thing. As a Girl Scout, yes, that's yours truly. Thank God those hideous white shoes have been cut off in this cropped photo. But that led to this, AstroTurf, The Private Life of Rocket Science, a cultural study, you know, kind of a family memoir of aerospace culture. And you know what? I think we've hit my time. I'm going to unshare. And why can't I get this to unshare? How do I get this? Can someone help me unshare this? I'm trying to get it to stop share. Thank you. Why is it still there?
I don't know. I think it's not. I think I just stopped it for us. I think you might just be seeing it on your screen.
Oh, good. It's gone. Hallelujah. Anyway, my last book was about Elizabeth Taylor. I continue to write essays. And I enjoy working with students who want to draw stuff with old analog materials. That should do it, I think.
That was great. Thank you, MG. Our next presenter is Don.
I will unmute. That's a good start. Hi, thank you guys so much for inviting me. I am really honored to be here. And I have a little PowerPoint show too, because as I told you, I really don't know how to do this without that. So this is me. This is the last slide. Those are my dogs, actually. And let me get you into percent. So writing across worlds. David and Emily, thank you. Emily, is that right? Thank you so much for inviting me. I am a scientist and a professor in psychology and preventive medicine and a poet. And I wanted to show you a little bit of what I do in science so that we can get a little bit add a little bit of what I do in poetry. And I was really trying to think, my first thought was they're separate worlds. I don't write across worlds, but that turned out not to be true. What I'm really interested in science is how to help people, if they're health behaviors, depression, anything, in real time using new technologies. So this is one of the systems that we built. It has a base station and smart watches and smartphones and little beacons placed all over the home to try and understand and intervene on family eating behavior. So this is what's called ILD, or intensive longitudinal data. And what you get when you start using this kind of system is just a bunch of data that we actually don't yet know how to visualize and really don't yet know how to analyze, but you really have to start thinking differently about people and how they work. So behavior, how do you model behavior? There are really temporal aspects of it, and I'm not going to run through this entirely to you, but what you see here is that, you know, some behavior changes in a minute, some in an hour, some in a day, some in a week, some in a month. It takes at least a year to form a habit, 6 months to a year. You know, and then all of these changing behaviors influence other behaviors. And then there's the people around you, and then there's the world around you and the people that are influencing how that all changes. And then there's the fact that behavior changes all these different ways. So there's like an abrupt change, or there can be a delayed change in level. So let's say that I am offering you some kind of behavioral intervention, like a poem to make you feel better. And maybe I read you a poem today and nothing changes in your mood. But tomorrow morning, suddenly you hear it back and something changes. Or maybe I read you a poem and it helps you right now, but tomorrow morning, the effect is over. So what we're really trying to do is build complex models of behavior. I didn't know if I was going to run this past you, but I couldn't resist it. And here's what's really complex about it. What we're trying to understand is, when should I read you a poem, or give you a nudge, or suggest some different behavior, or hand you an apple? And it depends on many, many things that change differently. So what is the meaningful moment when something might work for you? So let's say I want you to take a walk. Here's the probability of that behavior happening. And here are all sorts of other variables that feed into that changing of behavior. One of them might be the weather, and another one might be how much you like walking. Let's just take those two. And a third one is how badly you know you need to walk. And so if the weather's really good and you don't really like walking, but you know that you have to, you're more likely to go out walking than if the weather's really bad. So you need more motivation to go out walking if there's bad weather than if there's good weather. And there's a bunch of other variables that lead to the probability of a behavior changing, and they all change together, right? So think of this model of behavior. You think of it as all these variables surrounding it, and there's a little animal crawling around under the blanket, changing the dials at all times, right? So how does this relate to poetry? What I'm doing here is I'm simulating the world, right? A poem is a simulation, right? As a poet, I'm really doing the same things that I do in science. I'm just doing it with an entire different mind. And let me own up and tell you that it is really hard to shift from science to poetry. So on the days that I have time to do them both, I have to take a hammer out and sort of bonk myself over the head to move from one place to the next. It's really hard. In poetry, you have to notice everything. You're there to bear witness. In science, when you're at a faculty meeting, it's really better if you don't notice everything. You'll kill yourself. It's like death on a stick. So these are like two really different mindsets, and getting from one to the other is really hard. I'm making models out of the world in a poem as much as I am in my work, and I'm testing these models out. I am simulating the world. One thing I have in both worlds is this fear and loathing of imputation. Now, what is imputation? So if you've got data in the behavioral health world, and some of it's going to be missing, certainly with this longitudinal data, somebody didn't wear their Fitbit, or they forgot to answer the questions, or they lost in interest, then in order to make these models work, we have to impute, we have to make a best guess. So if you were really active last Wednesday, and the Wednesday, all Wednesdays for a month, and today I don't have your data on a Wednesday, then I'm going to impute about that level of activity. Yeah, does this make sense? Imputation, we got it? Yes, nod yes, great. In poetry, we impute too, I impute, right? I spent a number of years in rabbinical school. I never finished. I ended up getting an MFA in creative writing instead. So I'm forever imputing my relationship with God, or the divine, or whatever you want to call it. But it's scary business, you know, fear and loathing. So I have a healthy fear and loathing of imputation, and also it's very necessary in both worlds. So the drivers of science and the drivers of poetry in a way cross over. Curiosity about the world, noticing how things change. And for me, both as a scientist and a poet, it's not getting answers, because I don't think we've got them ever, but it's asking the right questions, right? And that just implies that you're forever searching. So thereby ends my little presentation, which will give you guys some time to catch up. And I just wanted to say that this is my website for poetry. I mean, my science is all over USC website. It's easy to find. These are dogs, more important than anything. But this is my website for poetry. And on it, there are some poems, a bunch of poems. So you can read that work if you want. And it's just donnasmetz.com. I thank you so much for your attention, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Donna. That was wonderful. There's a lot to think about. I want to have some questions I want to ask you when we kind of move into the question department about like imputation and intuitive leaps in science. Our final presenter is Robert Hernandez. So Robert.
My goodness, what a privilege to be among these incredible creatives. Talk about having imposter syndrome. Thank you for allowing me to share this space with you. Great job curating a bunch of creative misfits of all different types. I will also have a slide deck. I'm going to focus on, let me see if I can make sure we're in full screen and my computer doesn't crash. All right. So I'm going to talk about something that I've been working on with my students since the summer of 2015. And it's called journalism. Now, I'm going to try, I have a timer here to make sure I stay within 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to make this talk interactive. And we're going to have time for you to view some of the work the students have done. So get your smartphone ready, make sure you're on Wi-Fi, and launch the YouTube app. And I'll tell you why. So my students and I produce immersive experiences under the name journalism. It's journalism, but instead of a U, it's a V. See what we did there? A little cute typo that we had to trademark. And every semester since I created this class, we have found ourselves going on adventures all around the world, trying to figure out how might we use this new and emerging and constantly evolving technology of immersive storytelling. How might we use this for journalism and to tell stories of the underserved and underrepresented? We have had the privilege to have a really great reputation where we can approach tech companies that never think of content creators, let alone nonfiction storytellers, but approaching tech companies with pitches about how we might use their technology for this type of storytelling. I also work with media companies. We and my students and I work with media companies to pitch them and try to convince them on how they might embrace these new technologies to help advance the type of storytelling journalism tries to do, right? Journalism's goal is to inform our diverse communities by any ethical means necessary, right? Accurately, of course. And so we work between these two spaces, trying to convince each other, these two communities, to trust each other, to collaborate, and to work together. And to help them understand that, we prototype these types of stories. Now, I'm going to talk about awards throughout, but I really don't care about the awards. It's an award because I'm allowed to be a proud pop-up professor, but for me, it is a metric. It's a metric for my colleagues who may not understand the technology, let alone the validity of these experiences that my students and I create, right? This is a peer review validation that this technology is not a gimmick. As one colleague flippantly said, Robert, what you do, doesn't matter, you're an evangelist for technology. And that's not something that really kind of put me on my heels, because that's something that many of us have heard and experienced throughout our career when we're experimenting with something new. And so these two things, these communities coming together and prototyping these types of storytelling is what drives the work that we do. We have won a variety of awards. I'll kind of share it, but the first project that I want to talk about is a piece that took my students and I to Tijuana, Mexico about 3 years ago. In the before times when we had spring break, we found a way to fund a trip where I took students to Tijuana, crossing the border, to tell stories of what is it like to be deported. At the time, this was before the caravans, although we did stories relating to the caravans afterwards. But at the time, a lot of folks were being deported. Obama is known as the deporter-in-chief, and that framework was continued by President Trump. And while we were seeing these headlines of people being deported, we wanted to know, what does that feel like? What does that look like? So I want you to get your phone ready, launch the YouTube app. In the upper corner, you'll see a magnifying glass. In that magnifying glass, I want you to do a search for the deported journalism. I'm gonna do it too, just so you can see. It's not gonna take too long. The deported journalism. It might say, hey, you misspelled journalism, but don't worry, you did it on purpose. And you're gonna see this video result, 5 minutes and 37 seconds. We're not gonna watch all of it. I just want you to watch the beginning of it, right? As we begin the journey of what it's like to be deported. So you can hold your phone horizontally, landscape mode, and you can look around. This is called magic window, by moving your phone around or by using your finger to rotate. If you look at the video, just for better quality, you hit the pause and look at the 3 dots in the upper corner. If you select that, you load up a menu. There's something that says quality. Click on that and change the quality to 2160. That way it'll look better than what YouTube is first offering up. But you hit play and you start off at the turnstiles that you see. That's the last thing you see as you're kicked out of this country and enter another. For a lot of folks, they're going to Mexico, a place they hadn't been to since they were 6 months. And now they're 30 years old. On the right, there are folks, on the left are folks seeking asylum. I'm hoping you're doing this. And what I want you to do at least is to get to Casa del Migrante and have the watercolor art installation rebuild itself to go from this beautiful thing into this harsh reality. This project was one of our first projects that won the Webby Award. That artwork, that watercolor effect was pioneered by the students in one of the most brilliant hacks, right? We wanted to figure out, how might we make these unattainable places, how do we port you there to hold presence with places you may never know or experience? And have you hold presence with people like US, veterans who were later deported after serving, right? A whole presence with a preacher whose family was deported. He was deported and his American family deported with him. Or how might we use this immersive storytelling to reunite a father who's in Mexico, deported to Mexico, with his daughter who was held, who stayed, you know, she's an American citizen, so she stayed behind in the US. We brought them together through 360 when they called each other through FaceTime, and we bring them together, removing the distance, removing the wall that separates them. These are the new types of storytelling that my students and I try to figure out, talk about, try to produce and prototype, because there is no textbook for how to do this type of storytelling. It's being invented every day, and fortunately with my students in my classroom. We have an approach where we have really tried to democratize this technology that people think it's only for Disney or the New York Times, people with a lot of money, that tend to leave out diverse voices, women voices, people of color voices, from the possibility of those narratives. So we've collaborated with a lot of nonprofits. This one here was working with the housing insecure, the homeless community in LA, where we trained them to tell their own stories in 360 VR, and they produced their stories. It's called Homeless Realities. We won a bunch of awards, including the Webby Award. And for me, a really validating thing from the Society of Professional Journalists for 2019, this piece of journalism was the best piece of journalism produced by students across the country. We were ranked best in show. Again, I don't care about those awards, but it's a metric to show people who don't believe the validity of the technology or don't believe the technology could be applied for these stories on the human condition. We also use technology called photogrammetry for this particular piece, where we took a bunch of photos of static objects and converted them into 3D models. This is to pursue augmented reality storytelling. And to really do AR journalism, it's really complicated, but we found a little trick, which was Snapchat. With Snapchat, you may know Snapchat as the platform for ephemeral content, like celebrities making themselves puppies or throwing up rainbows. They also have a platform called Snapchat Lens Studio, which is free, that allows you to create this type of ephemeral content as long as it's less than 4 megabytes. That's probably the size of a typical MP3 song. And so we had the idea of capturing homeless dwellings through photogrammetry and creating these augmented reality spaces. Snapchat told us it wasn't possible, but again, the students at USC are pretty phenomenal. And we pioneered this, I don't even know how to call it, this interactive infographic augmented reality experience driven by audio. So if we had time, I would have you load up Snapchat, point your device at this yellow QR code, press it like the animation, like you're pressing a button, and it would load up a filter. But instead of your face, being changed, what it does is it brings Jennifer's reality into your space. Now, I don't recall if I enabled audio, so I'm going to assume I didn't. But what happens is, this is in the before times, I put this photogrammetry of Jennifer's dwelling from Echo Park in my office. She welcomes you. And after she welcomes you, you can interact with these hotspots where she decodes how she lives. Look, to survive on the street, you have to be an engineer. And this is the amazing part. I don't know if you caught it there. Let me rewind just to make sure. You can actually walk inside the tent and hold presence with her living room, her kitchen, her bedroom, her home. And we require you to crouch down to hold presence with that space, right? This is, again, pioneered by students trying to figure out how might we use the stuff. We actually now created a template for it that we give away. You can do this yourself if you want, but we've made it accessible every semester to try different projects. One project we did was photogrammetry of found items found along the Arizona-Mexico border in partnership with Reverend Jim, who was a curator of this stuff. We scan these artifacts and allow them to be brought to your reality so you can hear the story of carpet shoes, or why water bottles need to be black or covered up in black plastic, right? You have to go hear those experiences to understand that stuff. We've continued to do work with underserved, underrepresented communities. A year ago, so previous spring, we worked with the youth in foster care. Last semester, we worked with survivors of domestic abuse. We're in post-production, in the fall, during COVID time, survivors of domestic abuse. This semester, we're working with the Cherokee Nation to do some stories about stickball. We'll see if we can pull it off. It's kind of complicated. But for this one, the youth in foster care, we trained them again to tell their own stories in 360 VR. And in one set, she was an artist, one of the participants. So we gave her a headset and she created this 3D model world, just effort, you know what I mean? She made it so easily. We made a portal that you can step inside her art and see her world, right? This again is trying to figure out how might we use this technology for different types of storytelling. You know, most of this technology is being used for video games to go shoot zombies or fight Nazis. We're trying to use this technology to have you hold presence with communities that are often ignored by the media and quite honestly by us, right? Trying to avoid eye contact with these communities, empowering them to tell their own stories on their terms rather than us parachuting in, gathering and leaving. Yeah, I'll leave it to there and I look forward to the discussion. And again, thank you for letting me join you all. What a privilege.
Thank you, Robert. That was amazing. Thank you to all four of you for this just astonishing work and insight. And so we are open to questions from all of you, from the audience. If you want to just put them in the chat, that's probably the easiest way, or I guess we could also just raise hand. I mean, since we're a small enough group, if you want to use the raise hand icon at the bottom of the participants queue, we can call on you. We can call on you that way. Definitely interested to have all of your insight. I want to just start with a couple of questions because I'm just sitting here being completely blown away. I want to kind of pick up on something Donna was talking about, but it's across the board for all of you because I think you're all kind of operating in this territory. That notion of imputation. It reminds me of when I was writing as a non-scientist, writing a book about earthquake culture. I came across a phrase called geopoetry, which was a phrase that some seismologists used to describe the kind of imputation or intuition of studying earthquakes, because you can't create one in the lab. You have to wait for them to happen. And so there are a lot of what they call poetic leaps. And I always have thought about that as a kind of way that these kind of disciplines that we hold as distinct are not really that distinct. Everything is kind of operating at the beginning, at least, and maybe all the way through some kind of process of intuition or imputation. And I think I was thinking about that through all of your presentations. I wonder if we can start maybe with Donna and Robert, and then also MG and Nushin, if you can get involved in this too. I'm really interested in the role of that kind of imputation or intuition in terms of the work you're doing, and how it kind of opens up territory in some way.
Shall I start?
Sure.
Imputation is when you add what's missing, right? And when you infer what's missing from what you already have, from what you think you know. So imputation, because it's inferred from what you think you know, can go wildly wrong because you might not know the right things. You might be wrong in your assumptions. When I'm writing a poem, it may start with a phrase that I heard, or a prompt, or assignment, but mostly it's just you show up to the page and something comes. And then you follow it like the itsy bitsy spider and you impute where that's going. Often I'm very busy with the Psalms these days, so I'm imputing what that means and what it means to me. And then, you can go way out on a limb and think, whoa, and have to draw it back. And the same with science, especially in this sort of work that we're doing now. There isn't a lot known yet about that, really, how people behave in real time, oddly enough, and how organisms behave in real time. So we're taking what we know from static models of humanity and sort of imputing dynamic ones, which influences what we measure and how we see, because we're imputing it from something that's already in us. So what's really important to both science and poetry is getting your own belief system out in front of you, in examining that and being honest with yourself.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that, because that's, I mean, it does have to do with your own, you know, I mean, it could be confirmation bias, right? It could just simply be that you're putting your worldview over the world and then reading the world through that lens. So I mean, to follow up quickly, particularly in terms of the science, how do you navigate that or mitigate that?
Team science. Working in transdisciplinary teams, the work I do, I can't do without, you know, engineers and computer scientists and human computer interaction people and doctors and, you know, network scientists, and all of us think different. I mean, if you ask us to draw a model, our conventions are different. So my line means something than a control systems engineer's line means. In one kind of statistical modeling, the arrow points outward to mean a thing, and in another it points inward. So in science, the only way I can do it is to work with people where we have to explain ourselves to each other again and again. And if you don't do that in time, the project blows up. Been there, done that.
Robert, I want to ask you, in terms of journalism, that same kind of question, both in terms of that sort of imputation or intuition, but also in terms of, obviously in journalism, we don't, you know, the ideal is not to, I mean, we know what our particular sensibilities are, where we're coming from, but the idea is to try and not let that get in the way of what the reporting is telling us. I wonder if you can talk about those processes, particularly as you're kind of working with these technological models.
Yeah, well, I'll share you my interpretation of how I would apply it to my class. For some context, the students that take my class have never done this stuff before. They're different backgrounds from all across the university. They're misfits that want to create something meaningful. And it's a declearance class because I want to sit with them one-on-one to let them know what they're getting into, that this class is, my interpretation of that is a hackathon style class. Meaning, I don't know what we're going to make. What I do know is that we've made it with this framework where I bring passionate students together from different backgrounds, pair them up with different members of the community, and sprinkle in a technology that they're not beholden to in terms of legacy or how things have been done. We know that everyone has a story to tell. So I know, even though I have no idea what's going to be made, even though I give all the power over to the students for them to determine what is the community or the topic we're going to do, as long as I tap into their passion and empower them, as well as empower our participants, they're going to create something breathtaking and amazing that I could not have imagined, right? I'll give you an example with the Homeless Realities Project. I wish it was some great master plan that I knew this would work out, but it just happened and it changed the way I teach, where we brought these folks together, different folks, again, homeless community, and said, you know, we introduced the technology and said, what stories do you want to tell? Of course, as a journalist, I've seen coverage about homelessness in LA, and I might bring a flawed perspective, a common voyeuristic perspective to want to see what it's like in that life. But having them decide what stories they wanted to say and not be defined from their community, but where they're going, they came up with incredible stories. And one is Tim and Daisy that wanted to talk about their life. How do you foster intimacy in a relationship when you're living so publicly on the street? They had just started, they were still in the honeymoon phase of their relationship. She lived in transitional housing. He lived behind a construction site. Every morning he would break down his tent, take the metro over, pick her up, and then go out to the city for a date. That story is a story no journalist would have pitched. It was their story that they wanted to tell, to let people know the humanity of homeless people falling in love are still people. And the way that they told that story was really delicate and empowering, and it changed the perspective of like journalism students who at first were thinking, this isn't a journalism story. What are we doing here? but in the process really saw the goal of journalism and to amplify the humanity of it. We could not predict that. That hackathon, the unpredictability, I have faith that something like that will happen, that lightning in the bottle will happen, perhaps because, you know, every semester it has happened in varying degrees, but putting these elements together and empowering these elements to own it and advance it and prototype it and interpret it, no matter what happens, will yield something really exceptional.
Great, that's fascinating. Nushin, I wonder if I can ask you a similar question. I mean, one of the things you're talking about is kind of storytelling and abstract media, abstract thinking, and kind of developing, you know, let's say when you're talking about developing the language of light or developing kind of structures that are responsive in some way in terms of some of the installations. I wonder about also the role of kind of intuition or imputation or geopoetry, for want of a better phrase, in your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times for me, it comes, I mean, it's very similar process, but it's always creating the circumstances for the audience to put them in within the experience itself and allowing for the experience to activate poetry, to activate storytelling, to activate body memory. So by positioning audience on a sculpture or putting them in a room that is very certain, like not necessarily normal circumstances, but something that leaves you on an edge, it sort of pushes the question of like asking like, oh, where have I felt this before? How have I experienced this before? And it immediately reaches something deeper in the body that sometimes we don't necessarily have access to it through language or through saying, or sometimes even the memory doesn't come, but the circumstances, the experience itself together, the smell, the room, the sharing of air inside of the room itself, it sort of like brings that out, and it becomes a prompt for the audience to search within themselves to find what it is that I thought it activated in me, what it is the similar emotion in me. How is it that I have experienced this in my own past? I had one incident with the geometry exile that I proposed it to the audience. We had a mathematician that went in the room and she's like, oh, I love these games, I'm gonna get in there. And she was there for 45 minutes and there's no time for it. She came out sweating and like telling me like how at some point she was looking at the triangles on the other side and she's here and she hasn't figured out how to reach it. And she's like, it was a story of my life. I'm here and everything else is there, you know? And I really loved the fact that she was getting so personal within herself and she was kind of like in this other space and it's just talking to me and telling me like how it took her there. Without me really knowing this person, we were able to reach each other on a very deeply personal space. And I think that's really through the activation of space that happens for me to put these structures in a composition or in a set of order that can bring out that kind of story.
So it's kind of a, like with the audience, it's kind of a collaboration or a kind of transmigration in a certain way, right? I mean, you're kind of provoking things or things are being provoked, I guess, in them that are as important to the work as it is to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's always a set of rules to like, let's do this is first step, second step, because I think it's extremely important to keep certain boundaries, because especially within abstraction, things can fall really out of the bowl and you're like, no, we want to keep it within the circumstances, but like in here itself, there is ocean of possibility, and let's be redirected and not like necessarily fall out of everything.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself there. MG, I want to sort of turn a question to you in a slightly different way, which is that I'm really interested in this move from, as you said in your presentation, from visual, basically drawing to writing and back to drawing, the kind of return to a form or a way of working that you had sort of set aside. And I'm curious about the kind of, the intuitive aspects of that as well. I mean, did you, in terms of making that shift do you make a, did you, how conscious was it? How much did it, how did the return start? And also the question of sort of using images, I think it's true of other people we've talked to as well, using images as the kind of narrative material rather than only text, even though the cartoons often have text, except, you know, for instance, the Carter image is pure imagistic storytelling. I'm curious about kind of the similarity, the narrative similarities between thinking about image as a mechanism and text, and also the way that they diverge. Oh wait, you're muted again. There you go.
You know, there are a lot of people in this world who would love nothing more than to mute me at will. So, you know, enjoy that privilege. One reason that I wanted to leave the discipline of doing 5 cartoons a week was because I didn't have any exposure to the outside world. I mean, I was very envious as a young 20-something. I guess all 20-somethings are young. I don't need to say young 20-something, as a, you know, whatever. You know, I wanted to get out in the world and interact with people. I wanted to be the, you know, I wanted to interview 200 people who had put together that ridiculous doll before they died so that I would have a definitive body of work. And I wanted to know what it was, I genuinely wanted to know what it was like spending, well, you do wind up awake in the middle of the night after a Mars mission because the Martian soul or day is, what is it? It's 37 minutes longer than a day on Earth. So your circadian rhythms get all messed up. I felt that I had been too sheltered, and I was experiencing the world through media and not through actually being out in it. Now I've had enough of the world and I'm ready to get away from it. But as you well know, you know, it hasn't been an easy transition for me. I've had some ideas. And also, I mean, recently, I don't know if anyone else stumbled on it, but Linda Stacy, who had been a columnist at New York Newsday, roughly overlapping with me, wrote a defense of Andrew Cuomo, kind of a defense talking, and in this defense, she talked about the loutish behavior of the loutish and crudely sexual behavior of the male editors. Linda's, it's terribly uncharitable to say, but she is older than I am. And as a 20-something, I was just aghast at, you know, the kind of mistreatment. You know, I came out of Yale where I thought I would be, as you know, in one of the earlier classes of women, not so well treated. And then I was just horribly, you know, I realized this when I was showing some images to students and talking about I burst into tears. There were all these things that happened that were just so horrible. And well, I don't want to get overly passionate about it, but really before 1990, before those Anita Hill hearings, unless you were being chased around the desk by some predator, it wasn't sexual harassment, but feeling humiliated because of your anatomy, something that Linda Stacy talks about in that piece, you know, well, it's easier to relate her experiences because she's published them, and I haven't written about mine, but I mean, she talks about the editor who said, you know, come over here into the hall and we'll have this conversation so that I can, you know, watch your nipples stiffen in the cold. And it's like, this was every day in that place. And I just wanted to get out of there. And if getting out of there meant leaving drawing as opposed to going to a newspaper in another part of the country, well, I had reasons that I wanted to stay in New York at that time. So that was another big reason why I, you know, and now that I don't think whatever drawing, you know, now that the drawing would not be associated with an intolerable work environment, well, I hope it'll be easier to get back. That didn't deal at all in a lofty way with anything, but then that's my thing.
That was great. That was great. And I think, you know, like there are all sorts of reasons. We only have a few minutes left. And I want to just pose one other question that Emily, my co-curator, has posed about the sort of relationship between writing and creating, right? We're in a series about writing, and all of you are kind of talking about creating, but also about kind of vernaculars and language. I mean, I think the language of light was a phrase that Nushin used early on. I guess the question is, does it matter, or do you make distinctions between those two things, writing and creating, or does it even matter? How and what we do. I mean, again, the sort of the language of light, or MG, you had talked, about the idea that wordless images can be useful. So maybe, I know Nushin, you've got to jump off on another call. Maybe do you want to field this one really quickly at the beginning, and then we'll go over to MG.
Absolutely. I think for me, at least, they always go hand in hand. There is no separation. There is no first, there's no second. I feel like it's always a very fluid process. Sometimes ideas emerge from writing. Sometimes it's just like, it's through the process of making and creating that, like, there is like words that start to emerge and come, and like, oh, like, no, and I have to sit down and write. I never favor one over another. I feel like, as a visual artist, that I'm a lot of times better with materials and forms, and language some come second for me, but this is just, it's just because I've practiced one more than the other one. But I absolutely value both at the same time. And I feel like one cannot exist without the other one, and they just have to always help one another in the process.
MG?
I could yak indefinitely about myself, but I won't. Instead, I will point out how an eye-opening image worked this morning when that soft, vague, warm watercolor in that presentation of Robert's about, the soft watercolor, suddenly became the harsh, hard-edged, realistic photograph. I mean, I think you saw the power of visual wordless transformation succinctly, and in the service of succinctness, I won't talk anymore. Also, my dishwasher's making a noise.
Robert, do you want to jump since because I was also really intrigued by that kind of the both with the turnstiles and also the other watercolor, the way that they get introduced as line drawings and then filled in with watercolors, and almost like it's seducing us into the image. And then once we're in, we see the harsh reality on its own terms.
Yeah, writing for me, everything you create for me in my brain is writing something. And every time I write something, I'm trying to create something. I don't, when I was approached about this, I was a bit hesitant because I don't consider myself a typical writer, but we do create these things. The ethos of this class is, I don't know how we're going to do this, but let's find out, let's try. And that watercolor was a byproduct of a piece that I saw called The Sun Ladies. It's a wonderful piece, hard to find, but I'll tell you the nut graph of it. It was these women who, you see, blanking out, in the Middle East, these women were oppressed and sold as slaves, and some escaped, and they went and they formed an all-women crew because they knew that if they killed these extremists, if these extremists were killed by women, they wouldn't go to their promised land. And so these women would sing in battle to let them know they're about to die at the hands of these women. And they didn't have battle footage, so they used a product called Quill to create this illustration. And I mentioned it to the students, and 3 students were like, I'll give it a try. And just by iteration and failing, we ended up coming to this thing. Again, it wasn't some master plan, but it was so powerful and simple. What we really did was freeze framed the video and traced it, and then added splashes of color. And that transition was something that we fell in love with all the way through. And for me, it is whatever you make, there's a process to it, whether you come up with your own vocabulary or you quantify the systems in order to communicate and replicate this process, or you're going with your gut and you're in tune. For me, it's like jazz or music, where you're in tune with someone and you're riffing together and you're building and collaborating and making. That to me is the sweet spot that I get to do with students and others.
I think that's great. I'm teaching a class like that too, where it's like, it's basically a hugely collaborative, almost a lab class. And every week we sort of make it up as we go along, and it's been really like creatively exciting. So Donna, I think, this comes back to what we were talking about just earlier, that you were talking about the way to avoid confirmation bias is by collaborating and working in a group. So I wonder if, if you want to kind of bring us home here with just any thoughts you have on this question about creating and writing, or the kind of the balance of creating and writing, or in your own work, or whether in terms of the scientific work and the writing work, in a minute or so, I think.
Sure. It's easy. When I write poetry, I'm creating. When I write science, I've already created and I'm trying to explain it.
Do you mean in terms of the research or the gathering of the data is the creation, or in terms of the creation of the system by which the data is being gathered?
All of that.
Mm-hmm.
But the creation for science is the moment of the idea, and then the execution of it. And then you have to write it out, which is like barf.
Right.
Whereas I fucking hate it. Pardon my language. But tenure on that. And then, poetry, it's the act of writing that you show up for. Mm-hmm. But my husband, who's a visual artist behind me, that's his stuff. And I argue almost every morning at breakfast about whether image or word came first, chicken or egg, what's more important. I don't know. Okay. But I don't know.
I think actually ending this conversation on the phrase "I don't know" is exactly perfect. So we're basically out of time. So I want to thank all of the panelists. Really, just so much to think about. Thank you so much. And I want to thank the Levan Institute. Daniela. I want to thank Emily. I want to thank all of you for coming. As a program note, reminder again, our final On Writing event will be Wednesday, April 14th, 9 a.m. to 10:30. Maggie Nelson talking to Hari Kunzru. That'll be, I think, also a exciting, provocative event. Please come. And thank you again so much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Take care, everybody.